All right, we're going now.
Is it live? Okay, sorry. I'm so sorry.
All right.
On stage.
Okay, we're live. That's great. That's great. That's great. Welcome everybody. We can see that there are 18 people in watching us at the moment. Is it live?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I'm so sorry. And yeah, we're very thrilled to have you all with us today on this Q&A on narcissism. We reached out to the community to ask you to submit questions on narcissism, and we received a lot of questions, which is amazing and always very welcome. And we have tried to define down these questions into 3 clusters. But before we start, we want to begin with a question where we more or less define the word of narcissism psychoanalytically, so that we can start off on a point where we all kind of agree on what we're talking about. So let's go. So how can we define narcissism psychoanalytically these days, when there's an increase of the use of the word in everyday language to describe a wide range of behaviors?
We chose these questions to come first because when we were talking about this live, how to organize it and do it, etc., we realized that also many of the questions refer to narcissism. I mean, they use the word narcissism to refer to different things. And I think I don't think that we will agree necessarily today in what is the psychoanalytic definition of narcissism completely. Of course, there is many ways within psychoanalysis to define it. They're all more similar and they follow certain patterns. But of course, it's a word that is part of the common lexicon now, and it tends to mean something like self-centered, something that has to do with that evocative image that Freud chose, which was Narcissus, no? That person that fell in love with his own image, and that might be one of the pitfalls of the way that Freud wrote, which he has these evocative images that are very evocative by themselves, but then end up being evoking a certain idea that is not necessarily the one that he tried to define. I don't think it's our idea to, if we define it psychoanalytically, to then exclude the questions that are using narcissism in other ways. I think they're all rich questions, and we just have to clarify whether we're understanding this from On Narcissism by Freud 1914, or as individualism, or things that are socially promoted, for example, by capitalist systems, etc. That is there, Alexander. I'm gonna ask you. I'm gonna bounce the question to you. Is there a psychoanalytic definition for narcissism?
Let me say before I begin answering to this question, I'm really glad that we are all together. I've become over time totally bored by the situations when I'm speaking into my phone and then I upload what I've recorded. I think it's incomparably better when we interact and ask one another questions and so on. And then the second thing I want to mention, I'm not really fit today, so I hope I'll be concentrated enough and be able to answer the questions and say what I meant to say. When it comes to psychoanalytic definition of narcissism, I think there are several, and possibly there are far more and that I'm not aware of. It begins with Freud, of course, and then after the World War II, there are at least 3 major ones, and one is in Lacan, and the other one is in Kohut, and the other one is in Kernberg. And then some people probably would add Andre Green. So there are several different definitions. It starts with Freud's idea that in both primary and secondary narcissism, a baby or an adult cannot differentiate, cannot see the outside world, cannot see the outside reality, cannot see the external object, and so believes that the whole universe belongs to him or her. So various ideas grew out of this: infantile omnipotence, personality boundaries, and so on and so on. And after the World War II, to put it briefly, although mostly when we think about narcissism, we think about problems with self-respect. Someone feels exaggeratedly self-confident or not confident at all. Narcissism is about not being able to establish these boundaries between myself and the other person, using other people to be the means for establishing my self-respect, gaining followers or becoming a follower so that I don't distinguish between myself and the other people, and in that way I feel bigger and stronger than I am. So that's in a nutshell the limits of my understanding and knowledge.
There is this thing about narcissism in psychoanalysis that puts it inside what we call it the theory of drives, in the sense of we are talking here about, well, the later Freud, for example, about both let's say something that happens with libido. This is basically narcissism on the one hand, but also a libido that has as an object the ego. So also we are talking about ego, which is a concept that appears in Freud before, but it just gets really, really organized in the later Freud, in the ego and the id, let's say, where it's delimited, and the other two agencies, the id and the superego, are also delimited and put in relationship with one another. And I think that in that sense, narcissism as a psychoanalytic concept is one of the few that links both a theory of a drive with an structural theory. Let's say there's this idea of this edifice of the mind. No, there's sometimes the iceberg, or etc. There is a nice drawing by Freud in the ego and the id, that what he means in terms of a map, of like a topography, while narcissism is something that is referred to that topography, but is a drive. It comes from the place where, first of all, instincts of self-preservation versus sexual instincts will be those that are directed outside towards those that are just taking care of the biology almost of the individual, and a theory that goes changing, and in which narcissism then becomes love for the ego, no? Libido for the ego. So you need to understand a little bit the late Freud to see where that concept is located by the end of his writings, because it is subsuming in these two lines that he's working, which is the economical drive and the structural one. Super good texts to understand the first definitions are on Narcissism, an Introduction by Sigmund Freud, 1914. And then, well, the ego and the id, and Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Those that would be for me. No?
I would add Mourning and Melancholia.
Yes.
Not explicitly on narcissism, but explains so much about the work of mourning and then how cathexis gets from the object to the ego and so on.
Yeah.
And I'm not a big fan of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, but that's another discussion.
Well, we have another discussion then for later in the year. But then you mentioned that there are some definitions that if you have to stop us, Lisa, please go ahead. But
yeah.
Other definitions in other authors, and I think they're more clinical in a way. I mean, Mourning and Melancholy is a very clinical, let's say, psychopathological paper, and that uses narcissism as the main explanatory concept of why things happen, why depression and mania happen. Well, yeah, let's just keep going, because I think there are some questions about further.
Yes.
Maybe I can just, before we go to the question, I could say something from the Jungian view, because I feel like I'm a little bit of a different animal in here, you know, coming from the training that I have. I think I am, and I mean,
We're all different.
yeah, for sure. But still, the language is different. And if Jungian psychology should even belong to psychoanalysis, sort of, you know, people have different views on that. But this is just to say that narcissism, Jung didn't write on narcissism directly. It's actually, you know, quite absent in his work. He's not using that term or that terminology. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't touch upon the topics that we're discussing today. I mean, the question of narcissism has to do with the question of identity often, and it has to do with, you know, confusion or diffusion, or, you know, uncertainties also in, you know, what one's self is. We're going back to the original myth. You know, we know that there's the man who lost Echo and fell in love with, you know, his own image. And this is, I mean, I think there's good and deep and important reasons for why Freud chose to use that myth, because it's been fascinating people thousands of years before Freud came into being. So it's one of those archetypal stories, I think, you know, as a Jungian, I must say, where, you know, we have the Oedipus story, now we have the Narcissus story, and it's a story that has taken root in society, in culture today. It's a story, we talk much more about that than Oedipus, most of us. You know, we speak about our narcissism or the narcissists that we meet, which is also a question to explore. But on the question of identity, so the Jungian view on identity is that there's not only an ego. The ego is not the center of the personality. It's a center. But what Jung speaks about is this difficult concept to maybe introduce here, is the concept of the self. So when Jung speaks about the self, he speaks about an agency that goes even beyond, you know, the biography of an individual. It's more or less, you know, a religious concept, if you like, or a spiritual concept. But there is something in man that wants to be born or wants to be related to. We could use a word instead of a spiritual word. We could use the word conscience, or like an inner voice. That there is, you know, there is also something else going on. If we look at our dreams, we get a different picture. We don't get the ego picture. We get the self picture. We get to see the full picture of a personality. So when we speak about narcissism, I think on a very maybe simplified version to explain it, but shortly, narcissism also have to do with an identification with the self, like, you know, as an ego identifying with the self, and therefore also the grandiosity, sort of godlike, you know, behavior. I am, you know, the world is mine. I will eat its oysters, but also the fall of that, you know, being, you know, a nobody. So there's something about, you know, an imbalance in the personality structure. And a part of the analytic work with someone suffering from this, and most of us do in various levels, would be the work of getting a more healthy relationship to that, what Jung defines as the self, to find and develop the ego's capacity to not identify no longer with this all-embracing, you know, more sort of godlike, if you like, or archetypal concept. So just very much in short, you know, somehow that, yeah, it has to do with identity and the structure of the identity, but with Jung at the core of identity is the quest of becoming who we are. And that is also relating to something bigger that goes beyond our personal biographies.
Super, thank you. I want to move forward on an area of questions that were very prominent. And this also is, mentioned in the chat, how modern technology, mobile phones, iPads, gaming, social media, maybe the most contribute or maybe harm or increase or the development of narcissism. And the question in the chat was from Pasta Spaghetti, and they also wants to know our thoughts on chronic exposure to screen-based technologies. Any thoughts on that?
But you're not serving pasta or spaghetti.
I'm not, unfortunately, not at this time, no.
Ah. I don't know whether anyone feels very competent to reply to this. I haven't seen any research studies, and I don't remember reading essays about this, although there are some. Using all of the technological devices and then social networks and everything obviously contributes to greater amounts of loneliness, to probably greater amounts of chronic loneliness. It obviously destroys empathy because we don't tend to see events in real life as real life and the emotions of other people as emotions. We tend to see them as video clips or movies or things like that. I'm sorry, there are questions coming in all the time. So in that sense, there could be some contribution or how should I put it? There should be some detrimental influence. But for this, probably we need a lot of research on children who are growing up with this, or research even by children who are growing up with this, with digital natives. In the sense of the word that we've been using very psychoanalytically, so external objects, self, cathexis, libido, and so on and so on. It is difficult for me to imagine that if a person grows up without major problems, that then the use of social networks would make things much worse. But maybe I'm naive, I don't know. Maybe there's more to it than I am aware of.
I remember seeing a variation of this question in which the use of technology, for example, was by the mom, while the baby, let's say, was left unattended. Of course, it might be an exaggeration. I think it might happen. Maybe, probably, we will have patients in some years in which their primary carers were more on the WhatsApp than on the baby. And in that sense, if that were to happen, if we go to different theories of what is the actual origin of narcissism, particularly primary narcissism, and we don't take it as just like a given biological thing that everyone would have, but something that, for example, for Lacan, it's something that is socially determined, or more than socially, it has to do with this relationship with that super important other that we're going to call mother here, but you know that I mean a primary adult, in which effectively it is the image of the other, and particularly the way that other perceives my image and gives it to me back. For example, in the classic Lacan example, a mother that puts a baby in front of the mirror and says, "Oh, that is Nicolas. Look, you are him." And that is the image you catect, that you put your libido on. So I imagine that gaze of the mother is in something else. There will be problems in the development of that narcissism, understanding narcissism as that normal part of the functioning of the mind. Mm-hmm. There is then this other way to understand narcissism, that is narcissism as a bad thing, as a psychopathology. In fact, in psychiatry, there is a diagnosis called narcissistic personality disorder, which has to do with this idea of being very self-centered and to the point of being ill of it. But narcissism is a thing that should be working. It's the fact that we decatect some objects to get back to ourselves, to our egos, is not necessarily a pathological process. it can become, of course, but like in everything in psychoanalysis, not because there is a word to explain it means that it's clinical. Now, I imagine then that the lack of that gaze of the mother, for example, will have problems in the development of healthy narcissism, and could end up also with that more psychopathological one, that self-centeredness, particularly when it has to do with a fragile sense of self or ego. What also is called in psychiatry and psychology this hypervigilant, vulnerable narcissism. And of course, that could be developed as a defense. Winnicott also used to say that the baby's narcissism is some sort of an appendix of the narcissism of the mother, taking again narcissism as a part of the healthy functioning of the mind. So this baby loves itself, to put it that way, because it's loved. It's loved with so much care, like if it was part of that mother. I suppose that's my.
I'd also be very curious to hear about your thoughts on like the other side of the social media, those who actually make videos, because there's been a huge increase in people who are very, very interested in narcissism, and it's usually videos like how can I identify a narcissist, or how can I interact with someone who has high narcissism or has a narcissistic personality disorder or something like that. Why do you think there is such a increase in interest and in narcissism and identifying it and so forth?
I was not aware of these videos. The only thing I can say, by the end of the 1970s, an American author, Christopher Lasch, wrote a book, The Narcissistic Culture. And he claimed, so that is 55 years ago, that the Western culture has become predominantly narcissistic, that more or less all of us suffer from this problem. So then I'm not surprised by the interest in the general public, if what Lasch claimed makes any sense.
I just want to say, like, just from the 1970s and before that, we have also had an explosion of an industry which is capitalizing on being a mother. The market is a mother of trying to fulfill all our needs as fast as it can through technology and other means. So this is, I think, I don't know if that speaks for the interest, but just like, it's a part of the structure that wasn't there in Freud's time, or in Jung's time, or in the 70s ahead started. But today we have machinery behind, every communication we do like this, analyzing our data, looking at ways to optimize, feeding us in various ways, everything that we potentially desire. So this is maybe not an answer to your question, Lisa, but just to say that I think that the marketplace and its presence in upbringing and in feeding us in various ways is causing, it's feeding, a different type of, relationship and a different type of structure that wasn't there before. And probably if you look at these videos around narcissism and such, I've had patients that they come in and they know a lot about it, but then to working with one's own narcissism, that is again this. That's the mirror work of analysis. Psychoanalysis is not only mirroring back, an undistorted image. It's trying to help you to see more clearly. So I think there is something in these mirror makers behind, the technologies, that are sort of continuing also to feed a hyper sort of culture of, self-focus.
Also, if narcissism understood as this self-preoccupation, or those people who make others suffer too much because they need to preserve certain kind of a grandiose image. If our current political and financial system is kind of, I like that you use, Jacob, the word feeding, because there's nothing that this system kind of invents, but it just latches on something that exists already, which is a certain need for self-esteem, for the idea that you're doing well between peers, that you are more attractive, that you will get more, etc. It latches on it as I don't know, as sex, and the fact that you're gonna, you want to know which beer you're gonna buy, but there is one beer that shows you a sexual image, and they're gonna sell beer with that, but it works because that already exists. And I don't know, when there are these videos about like how to defend or how to outsmart a narcissist, I think they're might be talking a lot about narcissistic personality disorder and people who have the diagnosis, or it's a personality disorder. So basically it's a list of personality traits. So there are some traits that are more narcissistic than others. For example, being preoccupied all the time with fantasies of triumph and success and etc. When that becomes inflexible, etc., and many other personality traits are around that topic, then you talk about a personality disorder. But when I think about these videos, also I think that people who make them are aware that maybe it's easy to put a name to the fact that human relationships can be really painful. So sometimes if you have a romantic relationship that doesn't work, which happens to, I suppose, every person on the planet, basically, it's kind of easy to say, because the other person was a narcissist, or you have some sort of a beef with your mom, and because she's a narcissist. It's an easy tag, but the fact is, because narcissism is a thing that is normal, that can become disordered or disordered in the way of narcissism, sometimes one will suffer from another person thinking more about themselves than in one. And that will happen. And I suppose these hundreds and thousands of videos had to do with that common experience more than with the, I don't know, prevalence of narcissistic personality disorder having a spike. I don't think so. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Super. Thank you.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you're also invited to answer the question, not just to ask them, not just to
moderate
with them. Yes, of course.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking when we were talking, Nicholas, I was thinking about a lot about the videos or social media posts about, and also on Reddit, a lot of people writing about having parents who had narcissistic traits, they say, or something like that. It seems to be a very, very common thing today. And I guess that's also kind of a way of dealing with circumstances that weren't ideal. But I don't know what the need comes from, or how we should treat it, and how you guys treat it in therapy, for instance. If you have a patient who is convinced that their parents were narcissists, or one of them were, and that this affected their upbringing and stuff like that. I mean, that this also goes into like other areas of social media where different diagnosis is also very popular to kind of spread and to self-diagnose and stuff like that. But yeah, I just have a lot of thoughts on it. No answers.
Well, I would just like to say on what you said, Lisa, that I think there's something about narcissism and narcissists that goes back to this original idea with Narcissus as well. This is something sort of mythological. This is something archetypal. There is something in the narcissist or some of the narcissistic traits that is, we're getting fascinated by them. Before we hated them and labeled them and say they crushed our hearts, we were in love with them. We idealized them. We are in love with narcissists. We are the most creative people. Narcissist comes with creativity. There's this other, or with ambition. There's there's so much in sort of going back to Jung's concept of the self, that there is something going on in, you know, in people, and in this fascination that maybe is a little bit sort of, you know, more than just sort of the personal, that it, you know, it's something that fascinates us and fears, fascination and fear, which for me speaks about that there is something, you know, it's something of a charge here that is, you know, that is again has to do with really like the core of what we're longing for in ourselves. Narcissus was looking for his other half. Jung has a concept which he speaks about the anima, you know, or the animus in a woman, or the anima in man, or, you know, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud speaks about using this myth of how we're looking for our other half. You know, there is something, you know, very deep, a deep longing that is awakened by narcissism or narcissism. And I think that sort of holding this tension between this sort of, again, this idealized, beautiful, attractive person that's moving through the world without needs, you know, and we're running after them. And then this other, you know, dark side, what happened, you know, almost like, you know, evil, the evil, you know, that we're trying to avoid. So for me as a Jungian, I maybe it's not helpful for clinically resolving what this is about, but culturally, I think there's a fascination here that goes beyond our childhoods and our wounds. And narcissism is very old. If you look at the Bible, what it warns us about is self-love, the wrong kind of self-love. This is not a new concept. It is very old, but I think it's accelerated now by technology and an industry, again, feeding mirror makers, giving us what we think that we need, and we're confusing our identity, and we don't become who we are. And that is also the question with the beginning of the Narcissus myth. No, like he was prophesized, you know, was it the mother asking, will he live to well-ripe age? Yes, if he doesn't know himself. That was the warning, you know, for Narcissus. Like if he gets to know himself, then, you know, he will die young. And yes, he died and he became a flower. So there's a lot in that myth, and I think there's deep reasons for why. I don't know the story behind, you know, Freud choosing to relive that and give it life again. But sort of coming back to this idea of that this has, you know, a power that is, I would use the word archetypal again.
Cool. Okay.
I saw in the questions, Lisa, that you sent to us via chat, that someone asked about transference. And I think that's the basic answer to one of your questions. Whatever happened with parents in early childhood will be repeated in transference. And we will wait for it to start developing in transference, and then we will try to understand it and somehow to, even in some cases, cultivate it, and then try to interpret it to the patient. There is a lot of work on the so-called narcissistic transferences, which are believed to be fundamentally different than the usual so-called Oedipal transferences. So focused on the Oedipus phase of development, initiated by Heinz Kohut, then another approach by Otto Kernberg. They basically don't agree on anything. So people usually choose one or the other. But these are different transferences where usually the patient needs to feel that he or she is becoming one with the analyst. There's no rivalry, eroticism, and so on. There is a need that we're one so that I can feel more powerful because I'm one with you. And this will be focused, hypothetically at least, either on the patient's expectation that the analyst is perfect. And because I'm one with this perfect person, I'm better and bigger than I used to be. Or the analyst will be required, probably I should even say, to admit, to confirm that the patient is perfect, the best patient I have ever had, the smartest one, and so on and so on, so that I will have the confirmation. It will be obvious in the domain of self-respect, but fundamentally it will be about being one with this important person. So wherever the parents might have made a mistake, there the transference will be very active.
Interesting. Okay. Right. We had some questions about that we could continue with on treatment, psychotherapy treatment. I mean, you mentioned well, how would could you give some, or one of you maybe could give examples how narcissistic transference might look like in comparison to more Oedipal transference, or something, like if you have a clinical example?
I wanted to ask you, you were talking in the end about Kohut or Campbell?
I spoke more about Kohut.
Okay. Do you have an example?
Well, let me say in general, Oedipal transferences will be about, I'm better than you are. I'm smarter than you are. I know psychoanalysis better than you do, and such stuff. Or I'm totally in love with you, and I had erotic dreams about you, and then after this is over, we will get married, and such stuff. And this is basically what early textbook of psychoanalysis are full of. If you read Greenson, the book is full of these examples. And narcissistic transferences will be, you're the best analyst in the world, or you're the worst analyst in the world at certain moments, but it's about quality, exceptional quality, specialty. I'm a special patient, you're a special analyst, and so on. And then in Oedipal transferences, it is, to a certain extent at least, still obvious that I'm one person and you're the other person. I may like you or be in rivalry relationships or have erotic feelings for you, but I know that you are the other person. In narcissistic transferences, it's about the two of us being one or same or so similar that it's never been the case in my life that I've ever been so similar to another person. Does this make any sense? Am I?
It does. And can I have a follow-up question also? The Oedipal transference in some way refers to a third figure.
Yes.
While narcissistic transferences seem to not have that third, first of all, and second, trying to reduce this to one in the end.
Yes, this is fundamentally important. Thank you for adding that.
But having said that, in your experience, or maybe in the readings, because I tend to think, of course, of narcissistic transference as something that is, in a way, more severe, less neurotic. How right I would be if I say something like that, Alexander? What do you think?
Well, I don't know what severe means in this context.
Towards psychosis. From neurosis towards psychosis. That classical.
Narcissistic, I mean, narcissistic can be less observant, so to say, of reality testing. Because I tend to lump my analyst and myself into one. I tend to think, I don't even have to say, you'll know what I'm thinking. And Oedipal, very often, because there is the third, is about reality. I'm in love with you, but I hate your secretary. So I'm aware that there is external reality. There is something going on outside of this room. I hate it, but I'm aware that it exists. And narcissistic can go toward this, we're one, and the rest of the world will disappear. And we will just enjoy it as one unit. But I think again, there is a huge step from narcissistic personality disorder to psychosis. It's not nearby. Borderline being incomparably nearer to psychosis than narcissistic.
However, one of the first uses of the concept of narcissism as a drive concept within the psychoanalytic model is the model of psychosis. I would say in which narcissism, or that idea of taking that libido that should be put on objects back onto the ego, back onto the ego. It's complete. It's radical. It calls for this restitutive movements of hallucinating or deliria, etc. In that sense, I suppose it's not psychosis when we talk about narcissistic personality disorder, but narcissism as a concept is behind of the clean metapsychological explanation of psychosis by.
There is a moment when Freud refers to psychotic disorders as narcissistic neurosis.
Yeah.
But we have to bear in mind, I think, at least two things. First of all, we know from contemporary developmental research, I mean contemporary since the time of Daniel Stern, that primary narcissism never exists in the way Freud described it. And the second, that Freud never actually worked with psychotic patients. What he writes about psychosis, he learned from Jung mostly, and people who used to work at Burgholzli in Zurich, and then from reading books. So that part of his theory is not as relevant as some others.
Okay. Let's maybe go to some of the questions in the chat. Let's go with so a narcissist is never available to the analyst. I'm not sure if I can, or would you like to talk about oral envy and how it relates to narcissism, maybe?
Oral envy, did you say?
Yeah.
Oh, it's full of questions.
Yeah, it's a lot of questions. We have another one. We can also go to some of the questions that were submitted. Another question popped in now. I'm curious how we might conceptualize narcissism in children and adolescents, though, especially given the expected level of self-preoccupation during adolescence. So maybe if you could say a few words on that.
I loved it when I was a psychology student. My developmental psychology professor used to say, or I think quote from Vygotsky or someone, that adolescence is a pathological phase of development. That everything that would never be tolerated in a 40-year-old person is immediately tolerated in a 16-year-old person. So there are moments in adolescence when you're experimenting with this type of identity and that type of identity, and then for 7 days you are, I don't know, a hippie, and then a narcissist, and then partly psychotic, and then a communist, and so on and so on. And 3 months later, you can't remember that, or you're embarrassed when you remember that. And that's how adolescence goes. A contemporary societal problem, again, not a big topic for us today, might be that we're taking this too seriously. That people, when they're 16, might be feeling in a certain way, and then we should make political movements around that. But no surprises about that, if you ask me. Did I get the question correctly?
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
And what are we supposed to say about children?
Oh, sorry, I didn't send that question in the chat. Let me do that for you.
Just
Also, but yeah, how we might conceptualize narcissism in children and adolescents. Yeah.
Nicholas, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Now, well, there is, again, just to really fast, remember that narcissism it's a part of the functioning of the mind according to psychoanalysis, and also the same word is used for psychopathology. So conceptualize narcissism in children and adolescents. If we talk about the psychopathological sides, well, first of all, let's say psychiatry cannot diagnose narcissistic personality disorder in a child. I mean, It's not that they cannot. Usually it doesn't happen. Among other reasons why what Alexander was saying, that there are certain things that have to be normal during adolescence and childhood that wouldn't be in adulthood. It's pretty obvious what I'm saying. However, let's say that where is the question? When it comes to children and adolescents, you can find certain, let's say, things that are not working well, for example, in the clinic, that have to do with narcissism, and that had to do with a major preoccupation, too much preoccupation of about oneself. Let's say my weight, the way that I appear in public and I cannot appear in public, etc. Or the opposite. I mean, adolescents do go through, and children, I've read some cases, etc., is to be more studied, that go through depressions. And depressions have this mechanism of narcissism, in which narcissism, the catexis that you had towards another person that is lost, for example, can be a narcissistic wound, particularly if your relationship with them was narcissistic, which are more common in early childhood, for example, or childhood. So narcissism in there would be conceptualized in the way that how does that function of the mind, if you want, explains a psychopathology in an adolescent or in a child, for example. But that narcissism, the bad one, the one that is psychopathological, etc., well, I think you would tolerate much more of something like that, unless it becomes, damaging, in the sense of, it's not only that you're going to be a communist and then you're going to be a capitalist, but or you're going to like Manchester and then Chelsea, but that you're so preoccupied about the way that you look and you eat and you etc. That you get eating disorders, that you get depression, that you get social anxieties, etc.
But I think also connecting it back to adolescence, it has a lot to do with identity in those years. It has to do with trying to find a sense of self, a sense of identity through a group. And there's one Jungian concept around narcissism that Jung did speak about, and that's being sort of used, and that is the archetype again of the puer aeternus. Puer aeternus means eternal youth in Latin. And he spoke, and his followers spoke of, that there is a certain character type, a puer, a man or a woman who never really grow out of adolescence, who sort of stays in that state. There's something that happened in that state. So they stayed in adolescence, in that behavior of seeking their identity, thinking the world is just for them, not being able to empathize with the other, not being able to separate also from the other that they were raised by or fed by. So this is just to say that, Jung and followers of Jung have spent a lot of time in diagnosing narcissism in a way, but using another word, which is then this puer aeternus, which has again to do with this question of identity. Who am I? That's also what Narcissus in the myth gets stuck in. He gets stuck in his own mirror, looking for something. But there is, there's two sides to that, because that's also often why people come into therapy, with that, at least to me, trying to sort of figure out, to understand, also, or finding a sense of a purpose in their life. And so this is just to say that the narcissism is also a driver, like when it's not pathological, it's also a driver for then it can drive you astray, but it can also drive you right back to yourself. But in a Jungian view, that is sort of separating again from this idealized idea of a self, or that I am godlike or I'm a worm, That means somehow you haven't created, a sense of ego actually, and a relationship to that power that Jung defined as the self.
I would just like to add in one sentence, adolescence might be a perfect topic for one of our next meetings of this kind. There's so much to be said about it.
Mm.
Yeah, it's super important. Most let's say psychopathologies are diagnosed then. around there.
All right, we have many questions in the chat, and maybe we could talk about, well, if you had to choose between Cohort's and Kernberg's views on our system, which would you agree more with, or which have you had more success with clinically, is the question?
I think I might leave that to you, Alexander, because I have super little experience with narcissistic personality disorders, which are usually not super common in like, coming for therapy, unless something really bad happens. So.
I think in the contemporary literature, Kernberg has prevailed completely. Koch died 40 years ago. Kernberg's still alive and very active. He is 95 and still publishing and lecturing, and unbelievable. But to me, it's very difficult to accept that his position is grounded always in the idea of death drive, which I consider the most ridiculous idea in the whole of Freud. And then Kernberg also believes that there is no such thing as healthy narcissism, that narcissism can never be healthy, which I also find strange. I believe that a certain amount of self-respect, moderate questions reflected upon is something that's necessary. So I find Kohut more sophisticated in his thinking, less psychiatric, and more helpful. But Kernberg has developed even this shorter approach, transference-focused psychotherapy, that's becoming more and more prominent. So don't trust me completely. Maybe it's just that I'm, as always, old-fashioned like a dinosaur, and that's why I'm saying this.
Well, we got a new question of the role of narcissism in relation to death drive.
Well, let me do one sentence of self-advertising. Like 6 months ago, Professor Michael Kirsch and Professor Michael Buchholz and I published a paper on the death drive idea in Frontiers in Psychology. It's available full text, free of charge. You'll find it in 30 seconds. Everything I know about it is there, and everything I think about it is there. I don't think psychoanalysis has come up with a more ridiculous idea than that. There's no sort of empirical evidence for that whatsoever. Another topic we can discuss for 1 hour in the coming months.
Maybe suffice to say that from a, let's say, metapsychological, theoretical point of view, narcissism is born as a concept before this differentiation between death drives and the libido, but then it's put, at least by Freud, in the side of libido, more than the death drive. This, if we consider again that narcissism is a necessary part of the functioning of the mind, and not necessarily a psychopathology like Kernberg, for example.
There was another very interesting question in the chat regarding the ability to mentalize and how that looks like in people with narcissistic personality disorder. Maybe, yeah, Nicholas, do you have something?
I saw the question. They're able to mentalize. Many of them do it very well. It happens that mentalization also has this, or mentalizing not only has this ability, but it's not only this ability, but it's also how you use it. And it does tend to happen that narcissistic individuals either have a certain deficit in what we can call, I mean, what's not psychoanalysts at all have called, emotional empathy or just empathy, in which the idea of feeling the other is more important than just knowing the other. and that might be a deficit. But importantly, I would say that even if they mentalize really well, and the mentalization might be maybe put more on the side of the self, which is one of the, you can mentalize the other or mentalize yourself. Not necessarily, by the way, not because it's self-narcissistic people are going to be located more there, because the idea is that the way that they use their capacity for mentalizing is self-serving. So there is a way of reading the behavior, own and the other, as something, let's say, that contributes to your grandiosity. So if you can know what you're thinking and feeling, and you can judge it very well, but then that somehow is going to give you the idea that this is its exception. What you have, the way that you think, for example, or you can see in the behavior of the other and just overinterprets envy relation. So, but they tend to do it really well. I mean, also that's why, as Jakob was saying at the beginning, they're so attractive. You know, they do respond to you, and they know what you're thinking, etc. It's self-serving.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I like a term, I like to use a term that's not psychoanalytic, that's not professional. I like to say sometimes narcissistic seduction. I'm seducing you without any erotic premise whatsoever. I just want you to think that I'm perfect. So I'm looking for ways, I'm trying to discern what are the weak spots, so to say. What are the buttons I should press so that you will think that I am perfect in this or that sense? Or I'm trying to figure out what are the things I should say or do to give you a feeling that I will be the best follower ever, that you will always be very happy or very much helped by me being around. Like Ferenczi was to Freud and many, many other examples. So they probably can mentalize well, but focused on this. How will this person become my means to satisfy my narcissistic needs?
Okay, so we're almost 3 minutes before 7. So I guess we should start wrapping it up, unless you have something else that you want to share today about narcissism.
Well, I would like to say for the end, not about narcissism, but I'm very happy that there were so many questions and we had this lively conversation. And I hope we'll repeat this. I don't know whether narcissism 2 would be necessary, but there are so many other topics.
Yes, yes, it would be great. And also, if you have wishes on what topics you would like us to have like this conversation, please do let us know. Just comment or send an email or write us on Facebook or something.
Well, the only thing I'd like to add is when thinking about narcissism or narcissists, it's not like we think maybe shallowly as they are sort of self-loving, but I think what one finds usually in analysis is more like self-hate through the analysis. And just to say also, like I think statistically, people with severe narcissistic personality disorder are also, prone to suicide and such. So it's an extreme amount of suffering often. I mean, or sure, you have to differentiate. But again, it's an extreme state to live in, often I'd say. And I used to sort of remember that because it just tends to be this black and white discussion around this theme. And I think we did our best to try to give it some nuances, but there's a lot more to discover.
Now that you say this, and I know we're at the end, of course, you open the Pandora's box. But and I don't know why I didn't say this before. But my PhD thesis tried to empirically measure the distance between the way that you declare that you are. So self-esteem, let's say, if I ask you, you like yourself or you don't. You're good or you're bad. and the way that people automatically would associate the concept of themselves to the concept of something good or bad. And because I was trying to measure, well, coming from Mourning and Melancholia, but also going through Lacan, and it's not writing, a TV show that he made that now is a book called Television. And there is this thing there that says, we call depression to the distance between myself and the ideal. And I love that phrase. I read it when I was really young, so I went like, ooh. And it happened actually that even though my way of measuring this was taken from social psychology, etc., and other places, usually people would have this thing called implicit self-esteem, or a very automatic way of relating words done on a computer, on a lab, etc. People who were actually depressed, they had a diagnosis of depression, would have much higher self-esteem when it came to not being able to give you time to think about it, or to defend, or to repress. So yeah, I just wanted to say that it's kind of interesting.
You can see someone wrote in comments, "Let the Pandora's box burst." I'm sorry that I really have to leave at this moment, but you can continue without me, of course, or Nicolas, or you can record the short video where you will present the thesis and the results and everything, so that we can all hear.
Yeah.
I was not aware that this was your topic, so it would be interesting to hear about it.
Yeah, I'd say you can find it on the UCL repository of thesis. It's public.
Where we all go every day.
Facebook, Instagram, and that. Okay.
Okay, so thank you all for being here, and thank you for all of your great questions. And we will let you know when the next Q&A is. And until then, we wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye,
Bye-bye, guys.